Have you ever heard the expression, hoisted by your own petard? Well, today we're diving into one of history's greatest examples of that. It's a story about a massive unintended consequence. How the British Empire, in an attempt to cement its rule over India, accidentally created its most formidable enemies. This isn't just some random historical fact. It's the origin story for a whole blueprint of revolution. And if you're studying modern Indian history, getting your head around this is absolutely crucial.
So let's start with this quote from the British politician Thomas Babington Macaulay. This was the dream, right? This was the entire plan in a nutshell. Create a class of Indians who looked Indian but thought, acted, and felt English. But that raises a massive question, one we're going to tackle head on. What happens when the very tools you give people to control them, things like language and education, become the exact weapons they use to fight for their freedom?
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at Macaulay's original plan. Then, we'll see how that sparked a powerful intellectual awakening. After that, we'll get into the Western tools of revolt they started using, how they funded their fight with a pretty clever concept of a loan, and finally, how all of this created an ideological foundation that would influence movements for years to come.
Okay, let's dive right into our first section, Macaulay's unintended gift. See, to really get why this whole plan backfired so spectacularly, you first have to understand what the British were trying to do. This was never about charity or educating everyone. It was a cold, calculated, strategic move.
And that strategy had a name, the downward filtration theory. The idea was actually pretty simple. You take a small, elite group of upper-class Indians, and you give them a top-tier Western education. The thinking was that this group would then become your loyal administrators, your cultural middlemen, and all their new enlightened ideas would just naturally, filter down to everyone else, cementing British rule from the top. Simple, right?
Well, that brings us to Section 2, the Bhadralok's awakening, because this is where the British plan goes completely off the rails. The very education system they designed for control ended up becoming the ultimate incubator for revolution.
And wow, this slide just lays out the irony perfectly, doesn't it? On one side, you have the goal, create loyal Indian servants with English tastes. But the reality, the actual outcome, they created an educated class that got a hold of European revolutionary ideas and loved what they saw. You see, giving them the key to the Western library didn't just teach them how to be good clerks. It showed them a world of nationalism, liberty, and self-rule.
Now, over in Bengal, this new intellectual class came to be known as the Bhadralok, which means the gentlefolk. These were the guys the downward filtration theory was supposed to create. But instead of becoming, loyal cogs in the imperial machine, they became its biggest threat. They got really, really good at using the master's tools to try and dismantle the master's house.
And you can actually see the dominoes fall one by one. It's a pretty logical path. First, you learn English. That gives you access to a whole new world of European literature and philosophy. Reading that stuff, you absorb these radical new ideas about nationalism and democracy. And the final step? Well, it's almost unavoidable. You start to apply those big, universal ideas to your own situation and begin to ask, hey, why are these guys ruling us?
And look, this wasn't just some abstract political science class. The Bhadralok were reading the actual playbooks of European revolutionaries. They were totally fascinated by the story of how Italy became a unified nation, idolizing guys like Mazzini and Garibaldi. They studied secret societies like the Carbonari. For them, Italy's fight for freedom wasn't just a history lesson, it was a roadmap for India's future.
So once you're inspired by these revolutionaries, what's the next logical step? Well, that brings us to our third section. It wasn't enough to just read about revolution anymore. This new class started to build its own philosophy of resistance. And it was a philosophy that was radical, practical, and a huge threat to the British Empire.
And the conclusion they came to was, it was brutal and incredibly pragmatic. They looked at the British Empire and saw it for what it was, a machine built on superior force and technology. So to take that machine apart, they couldn't just write polite letters. They had to fight fire with fire. They came to believe that the only way to beat Western imperialism was to master its own tools, especially its modern tools of violence.
Their strategy was incredibly specific. As you can see, the methods were modern. We're talking revolvers and bombs. But the real goal here was bigger than just physical damage. This was psychological warfare. The aim was to demoralize British officials and any Indians who worked with them, to create so much fear that the entire administration would just freeze up, and to take out anyone, British or Indian, who they saw as an enemy of freedom.
Okay, but bombs and revolvers aren't free, right? A revolution costs money. So how on earth do you fund a war against an empire?
That brings us to Section 4, and the really ingenious and definitely controversial solution they came up with, getting a loan for a nation.
Well, they came up with something they called political dacoity, which is basically political robbery. They started targeting rich Indian moneylenders and government treasuries. Now, in their minds, this was not common crime, not at all. This was a strategic act. It was like a war tax they were collecting to fund the fight for their country's freedom.
And this is where it gets really clever. Genius, actually. At the scene of the crime, they would leave behind these pamphlets. And the notes basically said, as you can see here, hey, we're not stealing this. We're taking out a loan for the future national government of India. And don't worry, we'll pay it all back, with interest, once we win. It was a brilliant piece of PR, turning a robbery into a patriotic duty. Okay, so let's zoom out and pull all these pieces together in our final section, the ideological foundation. Because what these early pioneers did wasn't just a random string of attacks. They built a complete, comprehensive blueprint for revolution that would go on to inspire others for decades.
What they built, when you boil it all down, was basically a revolution in a box. It had everything. It had a clear justification for using violence against the colonial government. It had specific tactics and targets. It had a way to fund itself through political robbery. And, maybe most importantly, it had this powerful moral story that framed their actions, not as crimes, but as a sacred duty to a nation that was yet to be born.
So I want to leave you with this question to really think about. When a revolutionary movement is born using the oppressor's own tools, their language, their ideas, even their methods of violence, how does that fact shape everything about it? How does it affect its tactics, its morality, and the complicated legacy it ultimately leaves behind? It's a powerful reminder that history is never simple, and the lines between colonizer and colonized are often blurrier than we think. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.